Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States, was a contradiction in terms. He was the most popular American president. He was wildly popular. People loved him. He was also the most hated American president. People hated him. He, was really, really intensely disliked by a lot of people. He, he was regarded as a regular guy, as a man of the people who looked out for the common man, just regular people, not, doing everything to help out. He formed the Democratic Party, the modern one that we know of today, to bring and help more people to vote. He's also the one who took more power into the presidency and made the president more powerful than ever. And a lot of people accused him of, wanting to be king of the United States and to take over and become a dictator. He fought for regular people. He also was known as a racist. He was violent. He was all of these things. He was the president of the United States, and so he changed how we look at what we think presidents do. So we're going to take a look at him and his presidency and, how he worked. The 1820s to the 1840s is called the Jacksonian era, named after Andrew Jackson, of course. He dominated. He was the most important politician. He was the most important guy. Everybody talked about him. They either loved him or they hated him. They were for him or against him. But it was a time of great change. So let's take a look at how it becomes changing. All right. During this time, more people became involved in the process of electing a president, of the process of running a government, democracy. Remember, democracy is the rule of the majority. People vote. Well, the question is, who gets to vote, right? So Andrew Jackson is the center of the changes in the 1820s, which is why it's all called after him, the Jacksonian era. You see this in the music. The music before this was very classically oriented, very European oriented. People, were very serious. After this, the music becomes livelier. That means it's more spirited. It's more dance-like. It's faster. It's happier. It's more emotional. You see this in the art, in the pictures. People are dressed a little more colorfully. They're happier. They're doing more active things. You see, it kind of reflects everything about a certain era. So that's what we're looking at. Andrew Jackson is, of course, the guy on the $20 bill. Now, like we already talked about before, he's going to be replaced eventually by Harriet Tubman. And remember, because the lady who helped run the Underground Railroad, which helped slaves escape from the South into the North. This is when it starts to happen. But those bills should be coming out probably in a couple of years. You should see them. Andrew Jackson, of course, though, is on the $20 bill, and he's there because he is super important in how he changed the United States. And so we recognize him, and even though people don't like him today, there are still a lot of people who support him. So people thought he was a great president, and other people who hated him. So he's controversial enough that we still have him, but he will be replaced soon. Now you remember we talked about the War of 1812. Remember it was a tie. Neither the United States or Great Britain actually won, but Americans thought they won because, the Battle of New Orleans. Battle of New Orleans, remember, is the New Orleans is down in the south. It controls the Mississippi River. The British sent an army, their best soldiers who just come off defeating Napoleon. And Andrew Jackson was the general defending New Orleans. He was a smart guy. He set up all the soldiers and arranged that the British had to come and attack them, and the British did. And out of those, when the British attacked, they lost over 2,000 men. killed or wounded, while only about 20 American soldiers were killed and wounded. It was a huge, huge victory. And it didn't matter that it came after the war was over. I know the Battle of New Orleans took place about a month after the war actually ended. And the reason it took place at all was because, well, the news hadn't reached New Orleans that the war was over yet. It took about 6 weeks for the news to cross the Atlantic Ocean from France to all the way to, well, to the United States. And so by the time the news got there, the battle was over. Andrew Jackson had won and had become a hero. He was a war hero all over the United States, which made him hugely, hugely popular and would help him later when he decided to run for the presidency. So everyone in the entire country knew who Andrew or Andy Jackson was, the hero of New Orleans, Old Hickory. So here's a picture of Jackson from the time. In reality, he didn't really look like this. He was, here he's looking very heroic. He looks kind of like George Washington. His soldiers are all in the background. He's right in the front, and you can see like dead soldiers lying around him and like all kinds of debris in the battle. In real life, he didn't wear that kind of hat. That was, old-fashioned by the War of 1812. But he was, instead of being, in front with all the soldiers behind him, he was right in the middle of the soldiers. He's not one of those generals who would fight from behind, be way back, miles away from the battle, safe and, so no chance of him getting hurt. No, Jackson was right there in the middle. He was right there with his men surrounding him, and his men loved him. He was really, really popular with them. He knew how to fight, and he wasn't afraid to, get shot at. So Jackson was a war hero, and here they are trying to make him look more like Washington, but no, he was a down and dirty kind of guy. And so he was instead of being on his horse, he was right there up and marching with his men. So let's talk about the election of 1828. Until the 1820s, we talk about how the United States, it's more on the right to vote. Everybody gets the right to vote. Everybody gets to choose the president. Everybody gets to choose their own government. And it says in the Constitution, you have the right to vote. Everyone has the right to vote. Well, it turns out, before 1820, they didn't really mean that. Each of the states had the right to decide who gets to vote, and they allowed, well, first off, the only people who would vote were rich white men. Now, how did that work out? First off, only men had rights back then. Women didn't have the same rights that we do now. They weren't allowed to vote. In some places, they weren't allowed to have jobs. In some places, they weren't allowed to own property or make decisions. They kind of had to obey what their husband decided or their father. They weren't allowed to own, property. And if you were poor, you couldn't vote either, because basically they only gave the right to vote to people who owned land. If you had to own your own land, you had to own your own house, and they thought, well, how do we know that you really are, smart enough to vote? How do you know that you really care enough about a place? If you're going to own land, that means you really, really care about a place. Well, they kind of overlook the fact that, if you're poor, you probably can't own your own house, right? And even if you love your city, even if you love your country, just because you're poor, you're still not going to be able to own your own land. So before, they would say, only white landowners could vote. And of course, that means that if you are not white, Native American or African American, you couldn't participate. You were not part of the voting. So they kind of looked at that and just said, well, this is what is necessary to vote, right? As new states found out west, though, right, people began to spread out all over the country, and more people were able to own land because, how do you own land back in the day? Well, you would settle a new piece of territory. You move out if there's nobody living there, then you would clear it. That means chop down all the trees, plant a farm, plant crops, build a house, and if you did that and nobody tried to get away from you and you lived there for like 7 years, it's now yours. And all of a sudden you now have all these new landowners. They all wanted to vote. So the new states began giving regular people the right to vote, right? So all the other states also started changing laws. So by 1828, there were 3 times as many people who could vote than there were in 1824. So we start getting more and more people voting, and the election and voting becomes much more democratic. So these new voters from the western states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, they thought they would rescue the country from disaster. It had been run by the old white rich people from the East Coast, and they said, "Oh no, it's time. It's time for regular people." That's what Jackson promised. He's going to return the government to the people. The Constitution says "we the people," and it doesn't just mean the rich people on the East Coast. It means the people. So this is a shift of power from the East Coast to the West, from the old rich families to the farmers, the shopkeepers, which would be the people who own really small businesses. Other small businesses who owned him. People who owned like little general stores, little grocery stores. All the people who supported Andrew Jackson. Instead of see, he's not a rich guy. He's not from back east. He's from Kentucky. He's from regular place. So this map shows you the results of the election of 1828. Remember, our country votes, the people vote, and they choose electors, and electors then vote. Each state has a certain number of electors. For example, Louisiana, down in the bottom, has 5 electors, and they all voted for Andrew Jackson. They voted Democrat, right? Mississippi, all the Alabama, Georgia, all those ones in yellow, they all voted for the Democrats, which is Andrew Jackson. The National Republicans of John Quincy Adams, he won the red states, right? Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. Notice that New York is split in 2. 16 is red, 20 is yellow. It means that New York has a split vote. That means they divide the number of electors by how many percentage that they won. So 16 and 20, 16 for the National Republicans and 20 for the Jacksonian Democrats. That means that in the vote, Jackson got about 60% of the vote, and Adams got about 40%, so they split the vote so that Jackson gets 20 votes and Adams gets 16. Right? And so you add all those out, that's a pretty big win for Andrew Jackson. He won a whole bunch of, most of the states. He won a majority, and he won just about all of the states that are not the traditional old states. The traditional old states are New England, which is like Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. He won those. John Quincy Adams won those ones, but Jackson won the West. So here is Jackson being sworn in as President of the United States. You know that once you are elected, you take an oath. It's called the Oath of Office. You swear to uphold the Constitution, protect the United States, all the stuff that a president needs to do. And it's a very solemn, very dignified thing to do. So you see all all the people being dressed up in their best, and being very, very, very serious. Here's a picture of the inauguration. As you can tell, a huge crowd of people there showed up. Here's the White House, the new White House. Remember, the old one had been burned down by the British in the War of 1812, and you can kind of recognize it. It looks kind of the same as it does today. Only, of course, the one today is expanded way bigger and has more rooms and stuff. Look at the people. Some of them are very well dressed. They're really fancy hats, and they look very serious and look paying really close attention. And women dressed in fancy dresses and stuff. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. I don't know if you can notice. There's like horses riding through. There's like people. There's like dogs running around. There's like a horse being well, I don't know, jumping up and down. Now, when Jackson was inaugurated, it was a huge deal. More than 10,000 people showed up to watch the inauguration. Now, 10,000 doesn't sound like very much, but remember, back in those days, it's like really hard to travel around the country, and people it takes weeks and months just to go anywhere. And the entire population of Washington, D.C. was estimated around about 30,000 people at the time. So basically, one of every three persons in Washington, D.C. showed up for the inauguration. And that's not even counting people from all the other countries. Okay, so after Jackson was sworn in as president over in Congress, a huge crowd of people followed him to the White House. And he basically invited them all in, and it was a huge party. It turned into a riot. Everybody tried to go into the White House at the same time, and Jackson, almost almost got crushed against the door, and he managed to escape out the back door. And here's his quote: "It was the people's day. The people. I am the people's president. The people should rule. This is for regular people. It's not just for rich people. It's not just for powerful people. It is for all common Americans." And that's who Andrew Jackson was. He wanted to be the common guy, the regular guy who spoke up for everyone. So let's talk about who Andrew Jackson was. Andrew Jackson was born in this cabin. It's preserved. It's still there. They've saved it. You can go and visit. It's in rural South Carolina. Rural South Carolina means it's farm country. It's not in the city. There's not a lot of rich people there. South Carolina means it's in the southern states, and it's a small cabin. That means his family was kind of poor. It was March 15th, 1767. So that makes him about 9 years old when the Revolutionary War breaks out. So he was born before the United States was the United States, before the Revolutionary War, but he wasn't really old enough to take part in it. Like I said, Jackson was born poor. He was a self-made man, which means that he didn't become rich because his father gave him money. In fact, his father died before he was even born. And his mom and his brothers, they were all poor. Instead, he had to work his way up. He had to educate himself and make himself, rich without his parents, without his family. And it kind of gave him this sense that he's better because he works really hard, right? And as a young boy, he loved sports. He got angry real fast. He would also often pick fights, and same is true with lots of boys, and especially boys with lots of brothers. You fight a lot, and Jackson was no different. When the Revolutionary War finally reached his where he was at, he was 13 years old, and even though he was really probably too young to join, he lied about his age and joined the militia. He joined the army of just the local army, and was promptly captured by the British. So he didn't really have a big wartime record here. But here's his big claim to fame when he was captured. So he's because he was really young, they didn't throw him in prison, and they instead made him a servant to the British. And so they a British officer ordered Jackson to polish his boots. Right, get on the ground, shine my shoes, make them clean. And Jackson said, "No, I'm a prisoner of war. I demand to be treated as such." There are rules for soldiers. If you get captured, you're supposed to be treated like a soldier. You're supposed to be, fed. You're supposed to be, not made into a slave. You're supposed to, be treated like a soldier. And people and armies do. They treat the captured soldiers pretty well because they want their soldiers, when they get captured, to be treated well also. Well, the British officer got mad and took out his sword and gave him a whack and sliced Jackson's head in hand, and his and wounded him, and he carried the scar with him, well, the rest of his life. So here is a picture of the incident. Jackson, of course, is the short boy, and who's about to be attacked by a sword by the British soldier. Now, this is, of course, made after Jackson becomes president. It's meant to show people, who this Jackson guy is. It tells the story of, during the Revolutionary War. Yeah, he's too young to fight, but he fights anyway. And even though he didn't really participate in a lot of battles, he did do his own little battle, and was wounded for it, and stood up for freedom and, well, his rights. After the war, Jackson needed a job. He was old enough, and so he decided to become a lawyer. Now, because his family was poor, he didn't really go to a whole lot of school. He just kind of went to school whenever he could, and just had to spend a lot of time learning. He did a couple months here, a year there, a couple months, and he didn't, have a formal education. He never went to college. He did, however, have friends who were lawyers, and so he worked with them, and he learned to read. He learned how to read the law, and they taught him how to be a lawyer, and soon he learned enough to be a lawyer. He moved to Nashville, Tennessee, became a lawyer, and started practicing law. And he could figure out, he was pretty good at making money as a lawyer. There's some of the stuff seemed a little kind of shady, but he made enough, and pretty soon he was able to buy a plantation, which is a farm, and buy land, buy slaves. He bought slaves, and raised them, and got married, and became, well, a gentleman planter. It was the dream, that you would you own your own land, have your own family. But of course, this being Jackson, things were never quite that simple. The girl he married was already married. Here he met this girl and fell in love, but she was married to some other guy, and she was unhappy with him. They were getting divorced, and she got married to Jackson, right? But the problem was, there was some dispute about, like, when she got divorced and when she got married to Jackson, because if she got divorced after getting married to Jackson, all of a sudden that makes her what we call a bigamist. A bigamist is someone who is married to two people at the same time, which in the United States is illegal. And people began making fun of him, making fun of his wife, who was, well, she wasn't very pretty, she wasn't very popular, and people, bagged on, made fun of Jackson because of her, and including this slave trader named Charles Dickinson. And he got mad at Dickinson. They decided to have a duel. And remember, a duel back then was legal. You would have two guys, if they want to fight. Instead of fighting, they would take pistols, two pistols, each with only one bullet, and they would, back to back, and they would march off 10 paces, turn around, and shoot. Now, Dickinson had a reputation as a really good shot, and Jackson knew this. So Jackson let Dickinson shoot first, and Dickinson, shot him, and it went into his chest and came really close to his heart, and Jackson almost died. But according to the rules, if you Dickinson now has to stand still and let Jackson shoot him. And Jackson did. Jackson took his time, aimed really super carefully, and shot him and killed him. Right? Now, this made, and for the rest of his life, the Jackson had the bullet near his heart. And this, of course, made people began to look at Jackson kind of weird. This guy, Dickinson was a popular guy, and so they started whispering, "Oh, he's married to this girl who's married to another guy. He's a murderer." Right? Even though Jackson let the other guy shoot first, he then, very deliberately shot the other guy and killed him. So Jackson, people began whispering about him, and he didn't like it. He was angry at